I'm your host, Scary Pops, and everybody loves a good scare. So let's get into it.
Catching ball with you?
Yeah.
You need somebody to play ball?
One night, several years ago, I arrived home from the library and parked the car in the driveway. It was quite foggy, but the streetlights were on, and so I went over to the mailbox before going inside. At that point, I was not a believer in true scary stories, but what happened next changed all that. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, as a strange figure of a man was at the other end of the street. It was strange because he was just standing there, and I assume was staring straight at me. My fight or flight reflex kicked in, and I quickly made my way to the front door, with my hair just prickling on the back of my neck. I unlocked the door, and I turned to have a last look, and I nearly fainted, as the figure was now at the end of the driveway. Once inside, I looked through the window, and he was gone. I was trembling in fear. I couldn't decide whether or not to turn the lights on, but I continued to check the window. That's when I almost jumped out of my skin because the neighbor's dog started to bark loudly, and I heard the footsteps approaching my front door. I gasped and ran and looked through the peephole, but the front light wasn't on. All I could see was the eerie light from the street, which was creepy due to the fog. I was sure that the man was only inches from the door. Instinctively, I flipped the light switch and went back to look through the peephole. He wasn't there. I raced around the house and turned every light on, and then called 911 waiting for them to answer. Just then the phone went dead. I was panicking. I kept redialing, but it was pointless. I didn't know what to do. I was shaking in terror. I went to the kitchen and grabbed one of the knives. I heard the dogs stop barking, so I thought that maybe he had disappeared. I was checking all the windows and trying to calm down. I then went to my bedroom and sat on my bed. It seemed like hours had passed. I checked all the windows. Then I decided to go to bed. Then around 3 a.m., something woke me up. I sat upright, straining my ears to listen. I turned on the lights. The silence, it was so deafening, but my beating heart, it hurt with a slow building anxiety. Just then, the lights went out. I felt a cold breeze on my face. I screamed and leapt after the bed. I ran through the house, and then the lights came on. I checked the windows, nothing. I stayed up until dawn. Just then I could hear creeping on the front porch, as if walking away. I went to the peephole, but I couldn't see anything. All I could see was fog rolling in down the street. I never saw him again, and I can't explain what happened. I just know how I felt. I'm not terribly religious, and I was pretty much less than enthusiastic when Mom asked me to help with cleaning up an old church. She always enjoyed the interior decorating and was excited for us to work together. And I'm sure she had ulterior motives, as she always bemoaned the fact that I stray from the fold. I did elect to help her, though, and as we were going upstairs to work on one of the rooms, it had gotten to the point where it was pretty storming and it was dark. And I noticed the atmosphere was different. And it felt really cold up as we were walking. And as we went past the tattered curtains, I could hear the wind howling outside. There was one particular room that was gloomy and oppressive. I hesitated. My mom laughed and shook her head, and she's like, "What's wrong with you? You're in the house of the Lord." But I couldn't shake off the nervous feeling that I had as I followed her up into the room, and I picked up a broom that was in the corner and I started to sweep the floor haphazardly while she checked out an old leather swivel chair. She sat in it and started to spin around. Just then, her laughter, it turned dark. It made my flesh crawl. I turned around and tripped over the broom. The thing in the chair, it was not my mother. I was horrified. I couldn't even think to get up. This woman was strapped to the chair with straps, and she seemed to be possessed. Something unholy. She was thrashing and wrenching herself around as she tried to get free, snapping and snarling. I screamed, "Mom!" as the demonic woman screamed louder with a black, forked tongue flicking out of the mouth. Frantically scrambling to my feet, I picked up the broom and used it as a weapon. What if I was hallucinating? What if that creature really was my mother? I cried and searched my mind for an answer. My pulse raced. As I got closer, I saw a rosary tight across the cracked skin and the horrific yellow eyes staring at me. There was a deep wound where the crucifix had burned in the forehead, showing the black, putrid flesh. But before I got closer, the wind picked up so violently that the tattered curtains ripped from the windows. The possessed woman, she was writhing around. She was screeching loud. I saw welts and slashes form across her skin. Somehow I knew that the holy water was being sprinkled on her body. Then I knew what to do. I dropped to my knees and started intoning the Lord's Prayer. The deafening chaos continued around me. I can't explain how or why, but I could feel the drops of holy water flicking on my own skin. I clamped my eyes shut, and in a flash, the noise stopped. I felt a familiar hand on my shoulder. I looked up. There was my mom. I looked amazed. I jumped up and gave her a hug, and I saw the demonic woman was gone. The horror was over. I was happy to have my mom.
Sometime last year, I was holed up in my house for a whole day and night. My city had a huge storm come through that put everyone on lockdown inside for almost an entire 24 hours. Houses and roads were flooding, and on the news, there were even reports of wind damaging windows and ripping roof panels off of homes. I was alone at the time, spending the day on my phone, keeping up with the news, and just listening to the chaos going on outside. Around 5 or 6, the power started flickering, turning off for just a few moments, then turning back on. Then, maybe just an hour after this had started, the power fully shut off. I waited for a few minutes, expecting it to come back on, but after a while, I realized it probably wasn't going to come back until after the storm was over. I sat on the couch and started scrolling through the news again on my phone for any updates, until there was a heavy knock on the front door. It scared me, being so loud in the midst of such a crazy storm, but also because I was not expecting anyone to be outside in this weather. I stayed where I was for a minute, debating whether to even see who it was, but then the thought rolled through my mind that maybe it was just a neighbor needing help or wanting to ask if my power was out too. It was still absurd for anyone to be outside, but I went up to the door and looked out the peephole. Nobody was there. Perhaps I'd waited too long to check, but looking out, a really unnerving feeling came over me. I went back to the living room and opened a window, letting the minimal amount of light in from outside. I didn't have any way to charge my phone, and I didn't have a flashlight, so I kind of just sat there and stared out the window. Then, out of the blue, I swear I heard a voice outside. I swung my head around behind me, looking toward where I thought I'd heard it from, but of course, I couldn't hear it anymore. I waited again, but figured it had to have just been the wind making strange noises, so I turned back around. Almost right on cue though, I heard it again. Just a quick few words, like someone was talking to someone else. I got up and went to a nearby window, looking out. It was so dark and rainy, there was nothing really for me to see. Still, I stared out into the rain, and a sudden flicker of lightning lit up the area for a second, and in that second, I made out a figure not far from my house. I had no way to know what he was doing, or really anything at all. I just saw a figure for a split second, and now that it was dark again, I couldn't see anything. Getting more unnerved, I closed up the windows and decided to go upstairs to the bedroom. Despite this, I was still nervous about the knocking and the guy I saw standing out in the middle of such a brutal storm. It was hard not to wonder what they were doing or who they were talking to. Hours went by with nothing more happening, just the sound of the storm outside as I sat in the room. Then, just when I had started to forget about it all, a sudden sound faintly echoed from downstairs. It was a door opening. I could feel my face go pale as I tried to listen, but it almost felt like the storm had grown louder, and I knew there would be no way I could hear any footsteps at all. I just had to sit there in my own thoughts and wait, horrified in the small, barely lit bedroom. A minute passed, and then another, and eventually I got the courage to call 911, though I knew it'd be a long time for them to arrive. From the time I heard the door open to the time the police showed up, it had been over 30 minutes, and yet there were no other sounds, and nobody ever came up to the room I was in. All the cops found was an open front door and wet shoe prints inside the house. There were no indications of any intent after entering my home. It almost seemed like they broke in, looked around for a minute, then just left. To this day, there's been no answers to the events of that night.